Section 2.1, Example 3, write an equation for the sinusoid whose graph is shown below. So part of doing that is figuring out whether we want to use sine or cosine, and we could actually use a combination of each. Okay, I'm going to start with finding amplitude. So what we'll do is look from the top to the bottom. So we've got this at 5, and this is at 1, negative 1. So that's a total distance of 6, correct? So that means 6 divided by 2 would be 3. So our amplitude for this graph is 3. Okay. So our midline, let's see, would be at 2. Let's draw that in. Okay, so our midline is at 2. So that's B. So that's above the y-axis, right? 2 up from the y-axis. All right, now let's look at the period. So to do that, I usually like to start at 0. So fortunately at 0, our graph is going right through the midline, which is handy. So then let's look over here to see that same spot where our graph is going right through the midline after going down and then back up. So, oh look, it's 2 pi. That's easy. The period is just 2 pi. That means that omega is simply 1. Easy peasy. Okay, there's an obvious thing here where the graph goes down first and then goes up. Also, we already pointed out that the midline crosses through the graph exactly on the x-axis. So before that got moved up too, that would have been an intercept. And then the graph went downward. So this is more obviously a sine graph as opposed to a cosine graph. Although either one will work in any situation. I'm going to call this one sine. So let's start putting things together. So we have our amplitude of 3. We have a reflection because the graph goes down first. So negative 3. We have sine. Omega is 1. We don't have to worry about that. And since this was lined up perfectly with where sine starts at the midline, we don't need to do any sort of phase shift. So that part's easy. So that would just be sine of x. Notice I'm putting parentheses in here to differentiate it from b, which is up 2. And that should be a valid equation for this graph. Let's look at the next one. Okay, so this one specifically says they want us to write a cosine and a sine graph for this. Whew, fun. Okay, fortunately for both graphs, the amplitude, period, that kind of stuff will be the same. It'll just be the phase shift, honestly, that will be different. That's it. So let's figure out the things they have in common. So amplitude, let's start there. So we have this at 2.5, and this goes like down to negative 1.5. So together, 2.5 and negative 1.5 is a distance of 4. Does that sound right? So we could actually take and subtract those numbers. Let's be a little more official with how we're doing this. So 2.5 subtract negative 1.5 is 4. And then we divide that in half, which is 2. So we have an amplitude of 2. So amplitude 2, just set that aside for a minute. Okay, now look, half of that, so 2, in order for us to find that midline, which I've already drawn in here, it's going to be at 0.5 or 1/2 because it needs to be an amplitude of 2, obviously. So for it to go from the midline up to 2.5 and then from the midline down to negative 1.5, that will be a y value of 1/2. So our midline is at 1/2. So that is B. So B is 1/2. Next, let's look at the period of the graph. This one's not so easy because when I look at the x-axis, it's kind of a strange place right there. So it might be easier to choose another point, like a maximum to a maximum, or I could even choose an x-intercept to an x-intercept. There's various ways to kind of figure out the length of one cycle. So looking from those intercepts, right before 1 to right before 7, it appears that our period is probably 6. It's interesting that it's not 6 pi, it's just 6. That's important to know. This point, this maximum looks like it's at about -1, and this one at +5, so that would also indicate a period of 6. So let's write that down. Period of 6. Now the period is found by taking 2 pi and dividing by omega. So let's solve this and figure out what omega would be. So if 6 is equal to 2 pi divided by omega, we can cross multiply so that we have 6 omega equals 2 pi. And then divide by 6. So that would give us omega equals 2 pi divided by 6, which is also pi thirds. So our equation is literally going to have a pi thirds inside of it next to the x, if that makes sense. All right, next we do the phase shift. We already figured out the vertical shift. We already figured out the amplitude. We just now figured out the period. So now we just need to figure out the phase shift. All right, we need to do both a cosine and a sine. If this was a cosine graph, then this point right here would actually be on the axis, right? So the fact that it is to the left 1 instead could mean that we have a translation left 1. So for our cosine graph, we could say that phi divided by omega is 1. Okay, let's put this together into our formula. So we're going to do cosine first. Y equals amplitude 2 times the cosine of omega pi thirds. And then we're going to put our x here. And this moves to the left 1, so that would be a +1. And then out here we would have +1/2. So we could leave our answer like this, or we could write it as 2 cosine pi thirds x plus pi thirds, and then +1/2. For sine, our sine graph normally starts in the middle and then goes up. So here's a point where our sine might have started only like before it was moved up, if that makes sense. So, or it could have been here and then be negative and go down first. So if we choose this one, I believe that's a half. That would move to the right by 1/2. Right? Or we could do a left 2.5. It doesn't really matter, but usually we would go with smaller numbers as opposed to bigger ones. So let's do the right 1/2 option. And the reason I'm looking at this on the midline instead of on the x-axis is because it's already been moved up 1. So it's best to base that phase shift before you move it up. So I'm just looking at it on the midline. Okay, so for sine, we would have y equals 2 sine, same exact omega because it's the same period. Then instead of right 1, or I mean left 1, like cosine was, it's going to be right 1/2. So that would be -1/2, and then up 1/2. So if we want to distribute that through, so it's in the form it's asking us to put it in, it would be 2 sine pi thirds x minus pi 6 plus 1/2.